Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a Saturday show, which we don't always do, but hey, we are this time, and this is concluding our Eastern Front week, although we are bringing it a little bit towards the west this time. We've been right out to Siberia yesterday, although we kind of bust that myth with Susan, and now we're kind of going to Poland. And if you've been following World War II TV for some time, you know we have tackled Poland before. We've had Alexandra Ritchie on, our friend Alina has been a few times, Douglas Nash has talked about the fighting around Poland, Warsaw, and it's a subject that I find particularly interesting because I don't know, I just find it really interesting. So if you are new to World War II TV, please don't forget to click subscribe. Don't forget to like the videos you're watching, leave us a comment and share what we are doing on social media, and maybe even consider becoming a patron or a member of the channel. As always, if you open up the description there, it'll give you details about social media links, the books my guests have written, their social media links, so on and so forth. So that is your friend down there. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest. So she is from the Sam Houston University, which I have a connection with because I share a birthday with Sam Houston, which is something I found out a number of years ago. And my guest is an expert on the Polish resistance and generally the occupation of Poland. So Jadwiga Biskupska is here to join us. So here we go. Without further ado, I will bring you in. Good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Paul?
I'm very good. So Poland resistance. I mean, when we were chatting in emails, so often Poland is seen as a victim of World War II. It's the Holocaust aspect. And we're not belittling that aspect of the millions who had a very harsh experience, but it isn't the whole of Poland's experience in World War II. There's the defense of the country in the invasion. There's the Polish army, the aviators, things like that. So what drew you to kind of telling the story of the more defiant side of Poland, as well as the more horrible kind of victim side?
Well, a bunch of things did simultaneously. So I came at this from a couple of different perspectives. I was really interested in questions of German Empire since I was a university student, and German Empire abroad outside of Europe, but then German Empire in Eastern Europe is a particularly bloody and prolonged phase. So I became increasingly interested in Nazis in Poland, which is a kind of a dark aspect of German Empire in general. And I started asking, because some of my early training was in military history and in Holocaust history, and Holocaust historians ask a lot of really good questions, and particularly about people who are victims of violence, because they have this huge source base of people who survive and speak on their own and things. And a lot of those questions we ask about the Holocaust, if you take them to other places, you can get really good answers, because we sometimes don't pay that much attention to the agents of violence, perpetrators of violence, soldiers, right, civilians, guerrillas, if they're outside of the Holocaust framework. So I took some of those Holocaust questions. What is it like to think you're facing death during war? And I applied them to the Poles more broadly, and I found some interesting answers. And that's basically how this project unfolded.
Well, brilliant. And it's been a bit of a recurring theme on the channel about the separation over the years of Holocaust studies and military history, which I think should be always considered simultaneous. You can't have one without the other. And there's been discussions on Twitter in recent months about whether museums should have a sort of separate Holocaust wing and then a separate battle wing. And to me, they should all thread together, because that's the experiences are all connected. You can't look at Operation Barbarossa, for example, without looking at the treatment of the two sides against the prisoners and the local population, so on and so forth. So I'm all for bringing these subjects together and uniting them. So folks, if you have questions as we're going along, kind of fire away. We'll do kind of the broad ones at the end of the show, and then sort of ones pertaining to what we're talking about as we go along, and I'll put them up on screen. But as usual, we have a PowerPoint that we have with us. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and you will tell me when to move on and what we're going to be talking about. So please, everybody, just sit back and we will explore Poland's resistance in World War II.
Okay, so I'll explain for a second how I'm gonna frame this, because if we wanted to talk about Polish resistance during the war, that could conceivably be a lot of different subtopics. This is a huge phenomenon. We could talk narrowly about military resistance. We could talk about insurgency of various sorts, and then we could pick a particular political group, Polish communists, Polish fascists, a particular region, and we'd have a lot of different stories. And frankly, one of the things that makes Poland so interesting to study is not all of those stories go together. This is not neatly under one umbrella. They sometimes point in very different directions. So the way I'm going to tackle this is I'm going to look at a phenomenon that the Poles call not strictly resistance, but conspiracy, konspiracja. And this has a long time-honored tradition in Polish history because Poland, the Polish nation, has a fractious tradition of statehood. For much of the modern era, there's no Polish state, but there are people who call themselves Polish. So my research has looked at this group of people who call themselves Polish and who aspire to maintain or recreate a Polish state when it's absent. And the term for this in Polish is intelligentsia, which is a word we use in English, but not in quite the same way. Because we have different histories of statehood in the Western world and in the United States and in Britain. And the Poles have this fractious tradition of statehood. So when they speak of an intelligentsia, they're usually talking about educated people, but they're talking about people who are what we might call, this is a terrible phrase, nationally self-conscious, people who understand themselves as promoting a Polish project, okay? So I'm beginning with this, it's a weird who, it's not, XYZ person, it's this group of people. So why are they important during the Second World War? Well, there's two reasons and they're intertwined. The first reason is that they are targeted deliberately by Nazi Germany for extermination in 1939 and 1940. And the second reason is that this group of people does continue this intelligentsia mission, and it's exacerbated by the nature of their targeting, and they spend the rest of the war trying to figure out what to do about what's happened to them and trying to recreate some sort of Polish state or maintain, at the very least, a Polish national project. So what I'm going to talk about today, and in the time you give me, is I'm going to talk about some of the things they did during the war. And some of them are pretty obvious. They're military resistance. They're a full-fledged insurgency, the largest institution of which is known as the Home Army, or Armia Krajowa. But that's hardly the only thing that this Polish elite group does. And in some ways, it's not even the most interesting. Some of the more sort of smaller scale projects earlier in the war and occupation, I think, tell us some more interesting things. So that's how I'm going to frame this. And I'm going to tell you about a handful of individuals, trying not to load you down with names or acronyms. The Polish underground, like a lot of undergrounds, is kind of an alphabet soup of acronyms. So we'll focus on a couple of those. If you could,
and just before you get going, the definition of the word resistance I find very interesting immediately, because when Dr. Chris Millington was on our show a few months ago, and he writes about the French occupation resistance, he says the words resistance and collaboration are too loaded. He prefers the word defiance and acceptance. And what's your feeling about the word resistance? Because people immediately start thinking about people going out hiding in woods, blowing up trains, doing that kind of thing. And resistance can be as little as listening to an illegal radio show or chalking some defiant message on a wall of a building that you're nearby. So before I let you launch into your presentation, what does resistance mean to you?
Right. So that's a great question because there's not an easy answer.
Yeah,
And
I knew it was going to be a hard one. Yeah.
Yeah. Especially in Eastern Europe, it's the duality. It's resistance and collaboration. And the question is, well, what about in the middle? And it's not just that these are big, vague terms, it's that they're morally laden. And I'm not sure that the first job of historians is to make huge moral judgments about people in the past who are facing circumstances I've never faced. So I think that moral baggage, that moral weight is perhaps gets in our way. I'll also note that what really makes resistance, well, you can break it down in a bunch of ways, and Holocaust historians do this, and people who study insurgency do this, people who study France do this. And to me, the thing that makes resistance is, first of all, it carries risk of some sort. And second of all, it's aimed against something. In the case that I'm talking about, Warsaw, it's aimed against the goals of the Nazi occupation. But I have to add a further caveat there, which is that the Nazi occupation in Warsaw, like the Nazi empire more broadly, is a huge hash of projects. It's not one consistent institution. So you could resist a particular aspect of the Nazi regime and Nazi occupation and accept or go along with others. Right? And the elephant in the room, and in Poland, it always has to be one of the first things to tackle, is what about the Holocaust? because resistance is often understood in the West as rejection of the Holocaust, protection of the Jews. And that's one of the ways Poles resist in Warsaw. It's one of the ways they contest the Nazi occupation, but it's certainly not the only one. And there are major characters, major actors in the Polish underground resistance landscape who are anti-Semites, okay, who not only aren't, their resistance isn't targeted against the Holocaust, but that is a project that's outside of their purview. And then the other one is, of course, well, what do we do with something like a collaboration? Many of the people I'm going to talk about today effectively, in some aspects of their lives, get along with the Nazi occupation in order to do other things they're prioritizing. So they probably have an official Kennkarte, the identification card that the Nazi German administration required. They might have a formal above ground job. They might, as a general matter, obey rules and regulations so they're not caught. So there are lots of micro and macro ways in which people both resist and collaborate. So alongside some of your other guests, I don't think resistance collaboration is the best pairing. I prefer the term opposition, and I like to use the Polish term conspiracy to think about the specific projects people are engaged in against the occupation, which, yeah, you can put that under the resistance umbrella, but maybe we don't need that word capital R to start out with.
Brilliant. That's a perfect answer. I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, so the people I'm talking about are these intelligentsia, and I know this is, so your Polish coverage has been very Warsaw heavy. That's not an accident. Warsaw is not only the biggest city in occupied Poland, it's a place where particular things are contested and where conflict is particularly intense. So a lot of the study of the war in Poland, it kind of default ends up in Warsaw. And I'll note that the people I'm talking about are acting as Varsovians during the war. Either they're from there, they grew up there, born and raised there, or they deliberately come to Warsaw because of the significance of the city. They understand it as a place that's going to hold out, that's going to resist. And they sort of opted into this in an aggressive way. But the other caveat is that Warsaw isn't normal. It's not typical. It's not average. What people who live in Warsaw experience is not the same thing that what people who live in Radom or Kraków or Łódź, which the Germans renamed Lichmannstadt. It's not the same. And people who live in cities experience different things than people who live in the countryside. And Polish Jews have a particular intensity of wartime experience that nobody else does. So I'm going to talk about Warsaw, and I'll note that I'm going to talk about Warsaw between two bookends. The first one is the 1939 beginning of the war in Europe, when Nazi Germany invades Poland, and of course the Soviet Union helps co-invades Poland. So Poland has two invaders in the fall of 1939. So there's actually a hot war, a campaign. The Poles call the defensive war, and most of us call the September campaign. And conventional Western narratives of the war give Poland, a couple of weeks, maybe all 5 of its campaign, and then they forget about it, pick up on the Holocaust. And then if you have a really generous, 1,000-page monograph of the war, then there's a few notes at the end about the Warsaw uprising, and isn't it a pity that Poland has shifted suspiciously westward as a result of Yalta and Potsdam. And then in between, Poland is kind of off the radar. But for the Poles, and particularly for Varsovians, that's not true. They're having a 6-year war. Their occupation is a war. It is an active struggle, but it's not one, for most of the time, with artillery. Right? It's not one with armed and uniformed men, precisely because that's forbidden. It's constrained by the circumstances of occupation. So the first bookend is the siege, and the second bookend is what turns into the collapse of Warsaw. It's the late summer 1944 Warsaw uprising, the Powstania, which is crushed by Nazi Germany, while the Red Army waits across the Wisła River. And then the Red Army eventually liberates Warsaw at the beginning of 1945, which I know you've discussed thoroughly on the show. So I won't talk as much about the 2 months of the Warsaw uprising. That is very much its own story. And one of the things you'll notice here is there's a bunch of stories that go out in different directions, which I think is part of the charm of the project. So could you next slide so we could talk a second about 1939? Thank you. Okay, so even though many of us, if we're taking a non-Polish or Western or a broader European perspective, is Poland is going to pop up in the narrative of the war at a few moments, and other than that, not be the center of the war, or the center of the war, the story of the war. For Poles, they're very much at the center of the conflict, and this is why I think it's so interesting to study Poland in the Second World War. I know I'm well, I'm preaching to the choir here in the sense that I have a captive audience of people interested in the Second World War. They're not necessarily in Poland. Is that I think one of the things Westerners have to try and reconcile is how is a war that starts over Poland become a war that's not about Poland? And how do we understand Polish perspectives on this war, the enormously controversial historical policies of the present Polish government, of past Polish governments and Polish communist governments, is that for Poles, the war starts as about them and it continues as about them and their center stage. And they think that much of the rest of the world has essentially misunderstood the war because by 1945, much of the rest of the combat and the final formal alliances that win and lose the war don't think the war is about Poland anymore. Okay, but for the Poles, of course, it stays about them. So who's wrong or who's right, or do we have incompatible narratives there? But in September 1939, much of the Western world, the French, the British, the Americans, by the headlines of our newspapers, are paying attention to Poland. And what's happening to Poland? It's a hot campaign. Maybe it's a blitzkrieg, maybe it's a proto-blitzkrieg. They fight that out. And this campaign goes fairly quickly. It's basically concluded in 5 weeks, but there is an important battle in and around Warsaw. So Warsaw itself is besieged. And the important thing about that is both it's the foundational experience of the war for Warsavians who are besieged. The war doesn't miss them. They're not a home front separate from the front. The war comes to their doors. But it's also important that neither the Germans in their case white planning, nor the Poles in what is called Plan Zachód, the defensive planning for the West, neither of them really anticipate defending Warsaw. They don't anticipate a battle for the capital. So it's a bit ad hoc in how it's conducted. The Poles scramble together a further defensive army, an army of Warszawa. The Germans end up bombing Warsaw from the air, trying to soften it. And in fact, the city is besieged. The guy here in the top is a man, sort of an icon of the dying old order. His name is Edward Rydz. He's commander-in-chief of the Polish armed forces. He has the code name or nom de guerre Smigły, so he's always Smigły Rydz, just to complicate things. He is commander-in-chief of the Polish armies, but he dies in obscurity. He actually slips back into Poland to occupy Poland. And someone mentioned in the comment here, Roger Moorhouse's excellent book. One of the great things about studying this war in the last decade is 20 years ago, there were really no good works in English about 1939 in Poland. And now there are both Roger Moorhouse's book and Robert Forczyk's book that give us a sense of this campaign. So that's changed quite a bit recently, and is a huge gift to people like me. Next slide, please. Okay, so during 1939, Warsaw has this particular experience because it's besieged. Much of the rest of the Poland has very different experiences. Kraków is by and large unscathed from the campaign, which is why it becomes the seat of the Nazi civilian administration, the so-called general government. But Warsaw itself has this particular siege and blockade experience. And anyone who's ever studied something like Leningrad will realize what this does to a society. It changes class structures, it changes behaviors, all sorts of things become emergencies almost overnight, from sanitation to the food supply. And the guy who's the true hero of this story in every sense of the term is the man in the picture to the right. So there are 3 men in overcoats. The one who's dead center in the dark overcoat with a dark hat, civilian clothes. His name is Stefan Starzyński, and he's the mayor of Warsaw, the president. And he's a major national politician. And he's actually a Pilsudskiite. He got his background entry into politics as a fighter in Pilsudski's legions during the First World War. And Starzyński is supposed to be evacuated, and he refuses. The national government of Poland evacuates a few days into the war, which creates this huge rupture in state sovereignty. And Starzyński stays, and he tries to manage the city under siege. He puts together a coalition of people helping him, and he becomes a symbol of the fact that Warsaw, if not Poland, is going to hold out. And many people, this is their formative experience of war. For older people, they're going back to war. They're remembering World War I. For younger people, this is really their baptism of fire. And there are Warsavians who, because of the chaos of the campaign, don't end up in the city. And I'm thinking of one, later a journalist named Miron Białaszewski, always thinks that he's somehow insufficiently Polish, insufficiently authentic, because he wasn't there during this siege and the terrible bombardments during it. So this is the framing experience for Warsavians. They know that Nazi Germany is hostile. They know that it's willing to kill civilians, and they don't think of themselves, civilians don't think of themselves at least, as people defended by an army whose war is elsewhere. They think of themselves as people who defended themselves. And Nazi Germany, in contrast, acquires the opinion of Poles, in particular Varsovians, that these are people who are going to fight, that they're problematic. The rest of Poland might be docile, unlikely, but possible, but Warsaw is going to hold out. So Warsaw becomes the problem. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So even during this siege, before Warsaw itself capitulates, there's already the seeds of what we might later call, well, resistance broadly, but conspiracies, right? These specific contestations of what's going to become Nazi German power. And I'll note here, I'm just really going to talk about Nazi Germany rather than the Soviets, because unlike other places in Poland and in Eastern Europe and along the Eastern Front, Warsaw stays under Nazi German control until the bitter end of the war. So even though lots of Varsovians are thinking about what's Moscow doing, what's Stalin up to, what does this mean for us, their day-to-day antagonist is Nazi Germany in its various facets. So this campaign for the Poles does not go especially well. And in besieged Warsaw, a number of military officers are trying to figure out what to do about this. So these guys here, these are some of my military figures. The one on the far right is sort of the founder of what becomes a much larger military resistance organization. His name is Michał Karaszewicz-Tokoszewski. Understandably, he gets a number of nom de guerre that are a little shorter. And he volunteers to set up what he calls, loosely translated, the Polish Victory Service, which is an officer's conspiracy to kind of keep on the fight, even after the armies defending Warsaw capitulate. His superiors know he's going to do this. It blurs civilian military boundaries as they're constantly being blurred in Poland. So he founds this initial organization. It has many, many afterlives and many competitors, but it's essentially taken over by the exile government when it arrives outside of Paris and then in London, and they attempt to coordinate what's happening in Poland through this institution and its many successors. It is the chrysalis, the sort of embryo of what much later in February of 1942 becomes the Home Army. So this is early on. And there's a lot of military officers, which is deliberately, I have a series here of guys in uniform who are essential to the shape of what happens in Warsaw, though I will note they have a lot of civilian comrades. So there's Karaszewicz-Tokoszewski. In the center is the final commander of the mature Home Army, Tadeusz Komorowski, who goes by the codename Bur, right? So he's extremely important in 1944. Yep. And then the two guys, you've heard of him. Yes, you've done this before. The two guys on the left, the rather handsome one at the top is Witold Pilecki, also a pre-war officer from Eastern Poland. He does a number of fascinating things during the war. One of them is famously is he volunteers to become a prisoner of Auschwitz, so the emerging conspiracies can try to figure out what on earth is going on in this camp outside of Krakow. And then the guy beneath him in this unfortunate picture from the 1930s, his name is Stefan Rowecki, and he goes by the codename Grot, and he's essentially the commander of the Home Armies as they mature. And he is unfortunately killed in 1943 by the Gestapo.
And just to jump in with a question, we know when the Nazi, we're doing a show next week about the Nazi plan, Operation Green, to invade Ireland. So what do the Germans have a list of suspected people that might be a problem? Because, clearly military figures, they're going to have access to who the Poland's generals and colonels and major things are. Had they built up any kind of database, or do they not really care about that? Do they think so little of Poland they're not even perceiving there might be a threat from within?
Oh, no, they have perceived, so both of those things are true. They think very little of Poland, right, and they think a very great deal of its ability to be a threat long-term to either occupation or acquisition, because after all, what is the history of the 19th century in Eastern Europe? It's the Prussians and the Germans holding Polish territories, and those territories, by and large, staging a series of uprisings. So they know that the uprising potential here is a significant threat. But that will bring me to, actually, if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about that specifically.
Super.
Yes. And you've done this. I know you had Joachim Bühler as a guest, and he talks about the Einsatzgruppen in Poland in 1939, which is exactly what we're doing here, is So we have a military conspiracy in Warsaw, and Warsaw has a slightly different timeline than the rest of Poland because it has this long siege, right? And it doesn't give in until the end of September 1939. What's happening in the rest of Western Poland where the Wehrmacht is operating? Well, as it turns out, two things. One is the campaign with which we're more familiar, and the other one is the thing that Bühler has studied and published on extensively, which is Unternehmen Tannenberg, which is precisely this decapitation or kill order for Polish elites. Very obviously, that includes Polish military officers. If there's anyone well placed to set up a military conspiracy, it's going to be them. But Nazi Germany, given its ideology, doesn't simply understand that this could be a military problem, but it could be a cultural national problem. Because if the Poles have aspirations to manage their own state, that's also going to be a problem for Nazi Germany. So they make, and I didn't include it in this slide here, they make a series of target lists, or called Sonderfahndungsbuche, and they list about 62,000 people by name, but by implication more, because sometimes it says, and family and wife. And the Einsatzgruppen, the SS in this bottom right picture is an SS execution outside of Warsaw. And the forests outside of Warsaw are to find people who could be potential problems. So this is a resistance, prevention, or a pacification measure. And this is launched as Tannenberg in the fall of 1939, but it's botched in Warsaw, particularly because of the delay of the military campaign. Because Warsaw has to be besieged, because it defends itself, instead of the SS being able to proceed under the cover of a hot war and hide their body count of civilian targets under this hot war, they have a slight problem. And what they end up doing is they end up carrying out their orders once an occupation has already begun, and then they have to somehow disguise it or keep it secret. And this becomes one of the first chapters of Varsovian experience. The siege is obvious. Like most military campaigns, it's unsubtle. But the genocide that comes, this targeted killing campaign in fall of 1939, is much more ambiguous and hard to understand if you're on the ground. Right? And the best work we have on this is still like Bühler's work and Jürgen Matthias's work and several other German scholars, is from the German perspective. It's what this looks like, what orders the police get, where they are, who they're killing. From the Polish perspective, this is much muddier and more ambiguous. People know that they have friends and relatives who are disappearing. They don't know where they're going. They don't know if they've gone abroad. And ultimately, this is slowly resolved. And as you might imagine, rumors pour out for the rest of the occupation. People gone, people vanished. Starzyński himself becomes a victim of this campaign, the mayor, once the city capitulates. But his death is not announced, lest he become a martyr. And what happens instead, people see him. There are Starzyński sightings in all sorts of places. In fact, we're pretty sure he's dead by Christmas of 1939. And what happens is the SS in these Einsatzgruppen and then settled in Warsaw start killing the Poles on their target list in Warsaw. And this is Himmler's plan. It's Himmler, top left, unsurprisingly. And he uses, and Hans Frank, the new general governor of occupied Poland, helps him out with this, especially with the reboot of the plan that's called the AB, Außerordentliche Befriedungsaktion, AB plan. And they kill people in Warsaw. They take them to camps in Germany. They take them to improvised camps in various places in Poland. They hold them in Polish prison facilities, and they execute them in the forests outside of Warsaw, particularly in the forests north. And this is my little Google map there at the top right corner, so you see where it is. The Warsaw metro area is the pale, and then the tangent to the northwest, that's this little village of Palmyre. You see that? And this becomes a major execution site. And the contemporary pictures there, I took them, so they should be pretty clear, is the new sort of remembrance site and cemetery of the people executed in this forest. Who are they? They're the people killed on these kill lists. And that continues 1939 and 1940, but it doesn't really work because the whole point of these secret campaigns was to prevent resistance. And what's cropping up immediately, late 1939, early 1940, picking up speed in 1941, well, significant resistance. So basically, the SS in Poland and in Warsaw is sort of responding to circumstances and trying to adopt a new policy that'll deal with resistance, even as they're precisely encouraging it. Right? Could you go to the next slide, please?
And just to jump in, the very fact that there are these memorials and things to these awful massacres in 39 and 40, as appropriate as these monuments are, and we need them to be there, it's maybe not helping to get across this story that it's creating at the same time a spirit of defiance and resistance as well. It's again, it's this victimhood aspect of it that Western historians seem to think of. And we had Grant Harwood on talking about Romania, and his point about when Romania comes up in Western history is like a whack-a-mole thing. It only comes up when it's relevant to Western history, but they don't fill in the gaps in between when it's just Romania. And I think there's a sort of connection. What you're saying about Poland is it becomes newsworthy to the West at certain points, but the in-between areas have been a bit ignored.
It's kind of like flotsam, right? It's bobbing to the surface, and and then, as you might imagine, for the Poles, all the details are important and they're contested, right? So that the contrast is huge. Okay, so these grim-looking buildings are what the fallout of these 1939, 1940 genocides look like in Warsaw, because Warsaw is filled with intelligentsia who might potentially resist and who start doing so. So in addition to killing them at Palmyry, sending them to concentration camps in the Third Reich, a couple of institutions in Warsaw are sort of built up or commandeered for this purpose. And the one on the far right is, there are no good pictures of this that I've ever found, is a prison that's called the Pawiak prison, for the name of the street it's on, which means peacock. And as you can see from the top left, it's destroyed during the course of the uprising in 1944, and it really doesn't exist now. Just a chunk of it exists on one of the main boulevards that goes through Warsaw, Jana Pawła, John Paul II Boulevard. So the Gestapo and the SS settled from the Einsatzgruppe and from these mobile campaigns, settles in Warsaw, and it takes over the building in the center, which had been the Ministry of Education. Well, the Poles don't need higher education, so they don't need a Ministry of Education. So the Gestapo takes this over, and its address on Szczuch Boulevard, Aleja Szczucha, becomes a kind of byword for Nazi terror. Because what happens? Everyone who's suspected of anything ends up interrogated there in the basement. And the Poles have a term for this. There's these rows of chairs where people wait for their interrogation, and they call it the streetcar, the tramway, because you're faced forward on these fixed seats in the basement there. And that's where your interrogation is. This becomes the center of Nazi policing. This district is closed off to Poles. But what is the holding facility? That's Pawiak prison. And Pawiak prison had actually been a Tsarist political prison under the Russian Empire. So for the Poles, it has this long-term association with what they consider resistance, what occupiers consider political crime. And so this is what it looked like in the early 20th century. It's a big prison. It's designed by an Italian architect who does a lot of really nice buildings in Warsaw. This one less nice. And it's secret, because one of the things about this is when a ghetto is created in Warsaw in fall 1940, it's within the ghetto. It's actually enclosed within the ghetto. So it's a prison for Polish political prisoners, largely non-Jews, but some of them are Polish Jews. And it's kept from the wider Varsovian view behind the walls of the ghetto, and then behind its own walls. So it's a kind of an open secret. It's a threat, but what happens inside is supposed to be secret. We know because a couple of the prisoners survive and escape and end up connecting with other conspiracies. We know what happens in the prison. And one of the prisoners, a woman, Regina Domańska, survives the prison after multiple concentration camps, and she builds a list. And there's about 97,000 people kept in this prison. About 35,000 die in the prison. Most of the rest are sent to concentration camps in the Reich, Auschwitz, and other places. Many of them died during the war. So this is an institution that held 100,000 people for these 6 years. It's a sign of Nazi terror. This is a sign of Nazi Germany attempting to prevent the Poles from resisting in their former capital. And there's at the bottom left there, if you can see, there's a kind of a billboard. This is during the occupation, and scrawled across it in graffiti, which was illegal by Nazi regulation. It says, Pawiak pomścimy, we will avenge Pawiak, right? So the prison becomes a symbol of their own persecution. And it also becomes one of the formative experiences of people either trying to figure out how to oppose the occupation or caught doing the wrong thing. They're then dumped in cells with and tortured with people who have significant political connections, and it often jumpstarts them into much more significant conspiracies. So the prison becomes another baptism of fire, especially for young Varsovians. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
Okay. So one of the sets of physical institutions in Warsaw that defines the occupation is this complex with Pawiak and the Szuk Boulevard Gestapo headquarters. And Poles see covered trucks going between them for interrogations. It's sort of a symbol of Nazi power. The other one, which is much more famous, is the Warsaw Ghetto, right? And the Warsaw Ghetto is created in fall of 1940, and it's enclosed in the 15th of November 1940, and it encloses approximately 500,000 people, perhaps a bit fewer, in incredibly crowded conditions in the Muranów district. And when it's enclosed, it accomplishes the racial, ethnic, religious segregation of Warsaw, keeping Polish Jews in this constricted area for further preparation. And what turns out, as we all well know, is for their murder. And in the fall of 1940, that's not yet been determined, though, of course, concentrating them in this enclosed residential district is terrible for their livelihoods, for their basic physical health. And it means that for Varsovians, there's a ghetto, there's a genocide of the Jews happening in their capital. And they are at the very least witnesses to that, if not participants in it, observers of it. The ghetto and the or what we might call Polish Warsaw are incredibly interconnected and intertwined economically in terms of food and other things. There's resistance in the ghetto, there's resistance outside of it. So the ghetto becomes a story of its own. And we talked about this at the outset, is that's often told as its own story because it's so complicated and it involves so many people. But it's also one thing that happens in Warsaw. So if you're thinking about the experience of being a Varsovian, even if you're not Jewish, if you're Catholic, like the average Varsovian, during this war, you're besieged. There's a weird terror police campaign. There's soldiers, there are policemen everywhere. And then a big chunk of the northwestern corner of the city becomes a kind of a genocidal experiment project that's happening in your city, in your capital. The young woman in the center of the picture here becomes a character in my book. She goes in the West by the name of Mary Berg. Her name is Miriam, and she's from Łódź, which is a commuter city of Warsaw. And that's her with her boyfriend Romek in 1941, walking down the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's a nicely posed photograph. You can get a vague sense of how crowded it is there in the ghetto. And Mary or Miriam actually lives. And the reason she lives is not because of her family's connections or connections to the Polish intelligentsia. It's because of her mother's American passport. That's ultimately what saves them. And the reason she's worth mentioning is because there are very few things that will save Polish Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. And an American passport is one of the very few. The guy at the bottom left is a figure that might be recognizable to some. His name is Adam Czerniaków, and he becomes head of the Jewish Council of the Judenrat in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's basically commandeered by the SS and the civilian administration to run the ghetto. And the ghetto has its own trajectory, which I'll mention at several points. For Poles outside, it's a symbol of what Nazi Germany might be willing to do. It exacerbates Polish anti-Semitism. It indicates by 1942 that the Germans are willing to kill. And what happens to the people in that ghetto, briefly in 30 seconds, which they deserve quite a bit more of that, but I'll come back to them. In the late summer of 1942, alongside the Operation Reinhard camp system, they are deported. They're collected and deported in the Grossaktion to the death camp of Treblinka, north of Warsaw, and they're murdered systematically across the summer of 1942. This is hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps 400,000 people. A remnant of young people remain in the ghetto to do work for the Nazis, and these young people rebel. And they rebel in January and then in April and May of 1943 in the Jewish ghetto uprising. This is a resistance within a country that is broadly resisting Nazi occupation. And then most unfortunately of those Jewish ghetto resistors are in fact murdered by the SS in the spring of 1943. And the entire territory of the ghetto is razed. It's detonated. So there's an empty hole in the middle of the Polish capital. What does this mean for the Poles? 1,000 things. Probably the simplest in the spring of 1943 is it means that their occupier is willing to kill on a large scale if you resist. You might say, okay, that's the wrong message to receive from that Nazi treatment of Jews is always distinct from its treatment of other people. But for many Poles, those distinctions don't matter a lot. The ghetto is something it's symbolic of what might happen in the future. The irony is that the true genocide against non-Jewish Poles is actually previous, but people experience things as they believe them to happen.
Well, and to me, it's very in your face in Warsaw. I mean, we know other cities in Europe, there were similar things happening and Jews were being taken away, but it wasn't in that same obvious big wall with barbed wire on the top. It was almost discreet in place. I'm thinking of France and Marseille and Paris. You know, you could be living one end of a street and be completely unaware of people being taken away and deported from the other end of the street, because it was sort of subtly going on, not below the surface, but not in the same obvious way that Warsaw was. And I also want to just jump in and say, you mentioned about the fact that Poland only pops up in Western histories kind of when it needs to, is that there's no context of what Warsaw was like pre-war. And it was quite a revelation to me some time ago when I found out, you know, Warsaw was known as the Paris of the North in the interwar years, and very, very thriving and Art Deco. And I think that part of the story of how modern Warsaw was before the war is part of what we need to understand how the wartime experiences are shaped by some of that pre-war experience. I think there's not enough content. There's not enough introduction to the Warsaw or to the Polish story for Western books. I hope you'd agree with my comment there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the guy, if there's one person who's responsible for the beautification of Warsaw, obviously there are a lot, but if there's one guy who's given credit for it, it's Stefan Starzyński, the mayor. He basically runs a series of what we would call revitalization efforts. He brings electricity, he builds new schools and things, and he does it over 2.5 terms as mayor. And he's the guy sitting in Warsaw in fall of 1939 when it's bombarded. He watches the city he'd spent his life rebuilding. He watches it bombed by the Luftwaffe. That took a toll on him. So remember that a lot of the people living in the city, it's not just the space they live, it's their home in a real sense. They've seen it change. They saw it become the capital of an independent state. They're not neutral on what happens there, what happens to its squares and its cities and what they're called and things. This is very much their context in a way that I think some of us think, oh, well, you know, maybe we have a deep attachment to where we live, or maybe it's just, you know, it's more neutral. This is not a neutral space for Poles, and of course not for Polish Jews either. Could you go to the next slide, I think, on that point? Okay, so speaking of the physical space of the city, there's a lot of documentation from the war and occupation. We can sort of see how the city changes in pretty obvious ways. It's segregated. There's a Jewish district, the ghetto, which gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Is an indication of persecution. There are German districts, some of the nicer districts, residential districts, and there are German public districts, like where the police headquarters are. And then Poles can live in the rest of the area, which of course was significantly bombarded in 1939. The Germans change place names and signs. They change how the streets can be used and how public buildings can be used, even how churches can be used. And they paper the city with placards and warnings and announcements. And these, which are all versions of the same public announcement, it says at the top, Bekanntmachung or Obwieszczenia, which is an announcement. And the announcements are always bad. And by 1942, 1943, as you can see with the red one, they are announcements of executions. And the idea here is that this is a deterrent, that the occupation of Warsaw has moved from secret killings to prevent resistance to very public killings to prevent resistance. So Warsaw is violent for its entire occupation. And it is very, very clear to the people who live there that if they cross the occupation administration, that's not a fine, that's not inconvenience, that's forced labor, that's deportation to an unknown direction, or it's execution, particularly if you're male. So the threat is always present. And that's very public. You can see it papered all over the city. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
Okay. So in this circumstance, it's a bit of a sort of a prelude here. I worked in some Poles. Is if you're Polish, if you're part of this intelligentsia community in the capital, these people who understand themselves, sure, there's a bit of megalomania here. There's a bit of elitism, but indeed, you can't run a state, you can't maintain a state unless there are a lot of people who believe in it and who think that they're pretty crucial to it. And this is our intelligentsia. What do they do about the occupation? And the big, short, easy answer to that question is in the late summer of 1944, they rise up against the Germans. But that's, in fact, the last thing they do. And it's in some ways the thing that they are least well placed to do. Kossak-Szczucka understands very, very well. He wants an open fight against the occupier, but he also can't risk the entire Polish population to do it. And the problem is, as I've demonstrated through the ghetto, through institutions like Pawiak, is it's pretty obvious, even to potential military conspirators, guys who were officers, career officers before the war, that if they contest the occupation with violence, people are going to die by the hundreds and then by the thousands. That reprisals are the immediate policy of the Nazi German occupation administration. Fall of 1939, immediate case of this, just after Christmas in a little suburb called Wawr. Some weird thing happens and we're not sure what it is. It seems like two German policemen get in a fight with a guy in a bar who's like a known criminal. He's a no good guy, and he kills them, and somebody else might have been involved. What do the Germans do? They execute 110 people. Right? So if you hate this occupation, this administration, if it humiliates you, if it frightens you, if it's everything you didn't want for your country, as is true of many Poles and most of the intelligentsia, what you can do about it, the first item on your list appears to be not violence. If you attack this administration directly, your family will be massacred. The people who live in your apartment complex will be massacred. So for much of the war and occupation, the obvious answer, the one we pay attention to, we think of military formations and movements and the taking of territory, that's off the table on the Polish behalf. They can't do that. They have to fight metaphorically, or they have to fight in more subtle ways to prepare for an open contest that they might be able to win. And their tragedy is that the only open contest they get is one they can't possibly win. So they do a bunch of things. And some of them are obvious, and some of them I think are a little bit more peculiar. And the first and most obvious thing they do, and hundreds and hundreds of people are involved in this, is they realize that the first thing they're being starved of is information. Like victims of persecutions everywhere, one of the first things that their persecutors do is deprive them of good information. So there are information warriors all over Warsaw. They tell the news, right? They name names. They tell people what's going on. They tell people what's going on about the wider war. Varssovians care a ton about the hot war on other fronts, and they consume any information they can get about it because, as you might imagine, they understand they have skin in the game. So they want any information they can get about the war, and the best and most beautiful information is information about German losses. The public mood in Warsaw when the announcement of the German defeat at Stalingrad, people weep because they know, and that knowledge is a deep kind of a power, and that knowledge means that the enemy that occupies them might be beatable, which is a tremendous thing to know at the beginning of 1943. So Warsaw kind of explodes with what we might call samizdat, underground publications. And they're really hard to produce, actually. Printing equipment, it's illegal for Poles to possess printing equipment. It's illegal for Poles to have radios. It's illegal for them to have all sorts of kinds of books or access to libraries. So this is not easy to do, and it's not in any way safe. People are executed for this. They're tortured for this. It's dangerous. And the king of this world of information is the guy at the top, and he wears a lot of hats, like most Polish conspirators. They're not neatly military, neatly civilian, neatly religious. They do a bunch of things, which is why I tend not to refer to the acronyms of their organizations, but who they are, because sometimes somebody will be doing this and that and this in 1942. And the organizations disguise the fact that it's one guy and his wife. This one guy at the top, his name is Aleksander Kamiński, and he has a bunch of different aliases. He's probably best known in Poland for being a leader of underground scouting, what's called harcerstwo, or the gray ranks. So he leads scouts into conspiracy, and particularly into diversion and sabotage. And by the late occupation, that sabotage is evolved into an assassination campaign. But I think the most important thing he does is he writes this weekly newsletter, and it's called the Bulletin Informacyjny. At the top right is their first regular issue in the spring of 1940. You can tell that's rather more modest. They get, as things go on, as they secure more printing equipment, and Kamiński brings this into the Home Army in the spring of 1942 as that's formalized. So he turns it into the Home Army's newspaper, even though he'd started it in 1940 already. And it tells people what's going on in the war. It tells them what's going on in the city, and it rats out the Nazi German occupation about what it's doing. So people have some sense of what they can expect. It also does things like showcase the work of artists. This one in the center here, this is Holy Week of 1942. And the Catholic political imagery is clearly intertwined here. This is understood as a martyrology, and it's the names of people recently executed by the Gestapo. So this is essential to people. Having this underground information is essential to people having a sense of agency. And having information, having good information that's timely is the basis for all further conspiracies. Because if you don't know what's going on, if you don't know what threatens you, if you don't know the situation of the wider war, nothing else you're going to do matters. So the first and most central thing the Warsaw intelligentsia does is they try to get good information. And they try to battle and counter bad information. We might now call misinformation. The guy at the bottom, this is a famous woodblock print here. And it's a donkey or a jackass more properly. And the cut here is it's a propaganda smear at official Nazi information. It says, ja zawsze czytam Nowy Kurier Warszawski. And that paper, the NKW, was the official regime paper. And it was canned and propagandistic and things. So the idea was, what is the beginning of resistance? It's having good information, rejecting what the Nazis tell you. And a lot of the people who start in this, some people just write in the underground, they just read in it. Many people understand themselves to be in the movement, in resistance against the occupation, simply because they consume this illegal information. It's that important. But as you might imagine, this is a kind of a gateway drug to other conspiracies. You read the information, you pass it on. Now that's a crime too. You port it if you're a teenager, your scouting organization. If you're an underground university student, you sneak copies of this. You become involved in the printing of it. You write articles. You meet the people who write articles. It builds out a world that makes other things possible. Could you go to the next slide?
And just to jump in with a question, I mean, it's fascinating stuff. How do you measure the effectiveness of the results of underground newspapers? Because another recurring theme on World War II TV is about some of the commando missions early part in the war. And how do you measure their success? If there's a British paratroop raid on somewhere and all the paratroopers get killed, therefore by that classification, it's been a failure. But then you have to look at this more, the idea of how did it affect the German morale in the area? How did it inspire people back home? So in this sense, you talked about giving these people in Warsaw agency, but as a researcher looking at this with the benefit of nearly 80 years hindsight now, how do you kind of measure how effective these things were? I mean, are there German records of what their response were to seeing these things being distributed and setting up more teams to crack down them? Just basically, how do you measure it?
Yeah, so it's not straightforward, right? We don't have data about readership, right? And that's always the danger, especially of studying elites, right? Elites can say, I have this brilliant project, it's great, and nobody else cares about it. But with the intelligentsia, we have some portions of the feedback loop. One, we know that the Gestapo cares. We know that people end up in Pawiak just for doing this, just for toting illegal conspiracy. We have them in the records of Pawiak. Often they end up in Pawiak because they're doing this and they're doing several other illegal things. So the question is, how dangerous is this just on its own? But we have several cases of people who just appear to be executed outside of Pawiak just for their role in these conspiratorial publications. Usually not just for reading them, but for toting them around. They're caught with copies of them. We also have other indications of circulation, physical copies of these. This person, Artur has said Stones for the Rampart. I have it on a screen coming up when I'm going to talk about scouting. I guess Kamiński does lots of things. He's one of these people that he seems to have had 48 hours in every day, and I'm not quite sure how that's possible. This is in a place where life is physically difficult. Food is hard to get. And yet Kamiński does about 10 different things. So we have copies of these publications on this cheap paper that easily dissolves all over the place. We have them outside of Poland. We have them in France. And we have indications, people wrote about them in their diaries and letters, things that they could only have read in this periodical. And Kamiński, in one of his first issues, because he's writing a lot of this in 1940, he's not just publishing it, right? He makes this announcement to the Warsaw population. I don't think I put this in here. And he basically says, he gives them a kind of a primer on how they should behave, sort of etiquette under occupation. And he says, look, I know you guys aren't all resistors, though obviously he's trying to encourage people into active resistance, but there's a bunch of things you can do that's the appropriate way to be Polish. It's the appropriate way to be patriotic. That's pushing people from complacency, from quietude towards active opposition. What does he tell them? He says, When Germans ask you to do things, when you're forced to work for them, drag your feet, be as slow as possible. When somebody asks you for directions, point them in the wrong direction. Is basically make yourself at the very least grit in the gears of the Nazi occupation administration. And he's telling people this. And I spent almost a decade reading the diaries of Varsovians and things. People refer to these commands, Kamiński's commands in the bulletin. They're doing this at the very least. They refer to this. So we know that Varsovians are reading these. So it may not be a perfect, this is the readership. It also says across, and see if you can read in one of these, the idea is you're supposed to pass them on. So if we know how many copies of issues are made in 1942, 1943, tens of thousands, and then they're supposed to be read by multiple people and then destroyed if there's risk of discovery. So this is a potential readership of hundreds of thousands of people across Nazi-occupied Poland. And we have reasonable confidence that that's true. I've worked with people who do resistance studies in France and things. Kamiński's Bulletin Informacyjny has a wider circulation and a longer trajectory from spring of 1940 through the end of the occupation than, as far as I know, any other underground periodical in Axis-occupied Europe.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a pretty impressive public, and we have all of it. Every issue, not all of the supplements do we have, but we have every issue of all of them. They wrote up all sorts of things. Okay. Next slide here. So I get really preoccupied with some of these as I've spent so much time.
It's fantastic. Good. It's wonderful.
So the foundation of resistance, let's say, okay, the foundation of any sort of effective resistance is good information, but it's not just newspapers. It's more than that. It's a kind of an informational universe. It's sort of the transition between, say, like data and actionable wisdom, right? And all of this is operating in underground Warsaw. And this information business brings people together into small conspiracies. It brings them together into other projects because they're giving each other information, and it connects individual conspiracies in lots of different directions. So the man at the top left is a man who's one of the few people from this story who's known decently well outside of Poland. And you might have heard his name before. In the West, he goes by the name Jan Karski. And he's born in Łódź as Jan Romuald Kozielewski. Actually, his much older brother, Marian, is head of the Warsaw police, which is a great connection to have. And he keeps his job initially and tries to build a conspiracy in the underground and keep things going above ground. It gets him a ticket to Auschwitz, but nevertheless. So Karski, that's his nom de guerre, becomes one of the most famous figures of this underground informational world. Because what is he? He's an information trafficker, or a courier, as we might call him. And he's working for several underground groups. He's probably brought into conspiracy by his brother, but he joins one organization, that organization merges, and then it's caught out, and then it eventually is brought into the Home Army, to the AK. This guy is highly educated. He's very charming. He's very sophisticated. He's debonair. He speaks about 5 different languages. He's unmarried. He's not busy. He's been targeted as a member of the intelligentsia. So he gets this job, which is couriering information out of Warsaw. Why? That's about the wider war, right? Is information, what's happening in Warsaw, who's being killed, what the Nazis are up to. And then from spring of 1941, what the Nazis are doing eastward, because Warsaw is a stockpile location for the Barbarossa invasion. So Poles have very, very good information about what's being sent eastward and who's doing it. So Karski ends up on multiple missions, and he eventually ends up on a mission to the West, and he brings the Polish government in exile, then in London, detailed information on the entirety of the landscape of the underground. And I'll note, he's telling the exiles about lots of different groups of people who are sometimes fighting with one another. There's not one story because the underground isn't unified and it isn't hierarchical. The other thing he famously does is he gets Jewish friends. He's a Philo-Semite. He grew up in this very much Jewish, Polish-Jewish world in Łódź. He later marries, after the war, a Polish-Jewish woman, a dancer. And he becomes a professor at Georgetown, which is why he's famous to most people. He brings information to the London exiles about what we would now call the developing Holocaust, because he gets snuck into the Warsaw Ghetto and things. So he understands this very much as an act of resistance, and it's absolutely dangerous. He's caught by the Gestapo. He's caught by several people. He gets his teeth knocked out. He becomes so famous as a result of this by the time he gets to the West that it's essentially a one-way journey. because he's too prominent to be sent back. He briefs Anthony Eden in London. He doesn't get to talk to Churchill. Churchill doesn't really want to talk to the Poles, especially with the warming British-Soviet relationship, which puts the Poles on the outside. Karski does make it to the United States. He talks famously to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he tries to make a case for active intervention by the Western allies, but anyone will do, into Poland. And he tries to make a case for the fact that what the Poles are doing constitutes a kind of affront of the war. And he demonstrates this with information. So he's a symbol of this here. And obviously one of the pieces of information he's bringing, which looms ever larger in importance as we understand it, is that the Jews of Poland are being murdered. And frankly, no one really believes that information at the time. It seems it's horrible, but spectacularly horrible. It seems, and Karski is told this, well, you're a sophisticated man, you're believable, but that's really kind of unbelievable. Karski himself recruits a bunch of couriers who come back to Warsaw, but he has a comrade here. Actually, they met at several points, but weren't close. And she's in the bottom right, hat obscuring her face. Sorry about that. Her name is Zofia Kossak, and she's sometimes known by her second husband's name as Zofia Kossak-Szczucka, but simplify things here. She's also a writer and a participant in a courier of information, but locally speaking. She moves around Poland. In Warsaw especially, she ends up in Częstochowa at the end of the war at the Marian Shrine there. She ends up in Auschwitz. She's imprisoned. She's caught for some of her resistance work, and she writes fanatically. She writes about 10 different publications. She writes underground things. She writes 4 different titles. She writes for the Bulletin, for Kamiński's newspaper, and she writes her own. And this is the bottom left is Prawda, which means truth. And that's her journal. What is it about? It's basically national Catholic news. She's devoutly religious. And she's, by the way, also a cultural and theological anti-Semite. And yeah, she is very much, and she's very openly so. And the obvious testament of that is the document in the middle, which just says protest. And it's signed with the seal of something that calls itself the Front Odrodzenia Polski, the Front for the Rebirth of Poland, or FOP. And it's her organization, which is a political religious organization that understands itself as on a crusade to build a future independent Poland that's virtuous and religious and free. And despite all this, and despite her anti-Semitism, when the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto are deported to Treblinka, are liquidated, as the Nazi euphemism goes, she knows they're being murdered. She knows this straightforwardly, and she issues this protest to her fellow Polish elites, to the intelligentsia, and she says, you guys are doing nothing about this. These people are being killed. And she mentions in the protest, and I could read portions of it, but bear with me here, that Poles know that this is happening, and she understands it as both the religious and political obligation to intervene, that they should protest, that this is a problem. It's something happening to Jews and not to them. So she is very aware in 1942 that this is happening. And she says nothing can be done about it, but the moral point must be made. And then she goes and does something about it. And she builds an organization to rescue Jews called Żegota, which she is involved in for the rest of the war. What's the basis of this? All of this is good information that allows people to resist in further ways. That's what's a key here. And the top right is, she lived actually quite a long life. And after the war, she was sort of explaining a lot of the things that had happened to her. And she admits some things she's quite quiet about that she did. And one of the things she says in this transcript of an interview at the top, she says, we might have published a little too much underground material. We were so excited about it. We just couldn't resist. There were maybe too many titles in the underground, but it was the basis of any further resistance. And so that was why it was so important. Could you go to the next slide?
And just I had a question from who was it?
Yes.
ZKR99. Are there English translations of some of these newspapers and publications available online to look at?
There is definitely a translation of the protest you can get, and I think it's at sprawiedliwi.pl. If you Google Kossak, Kossak, and protest 1942, a Polish organization has fully translated, so you can get her whole protest. Okay. But this is another sort of, where does Poland fit in this war story? There are some things about this story that are translated. In general, things that involve the Western allies. So things about Karski are translated. Things about Warsaw itself are not. So the Bulletin Informacyjny, we have microfilm of all of it. I don't think any of it's ever been translated. We have major diarists and people involved in this. Their work has not been translated. more of the work relating to the Holocaust in Warsaw is translated than the resistance of non-Jewish Poles. So
Yeah,
they're
which is bringing us back that theme we established right at the beginning of Poland being seen in terms of the writing and study of it very much still as the victims and the Holocaust, which is all worthy study. And we're not saying we don't want more of that information, but there's another, people have been saying in the sidebar, the complexity of Poland. We're kind of getting a little bit of that complexity, but there's a lot more that we're just not getting yet. And thank you for bringing some of it to our attention.
Yeah, the complexity is really the point, right? And I think historians of the Second World War and are really up for that, right? That's one of the things that is that, okay, let's get down into the weeds. No, let's get below that, because the details matter. Yeah. And they really do. And one of the dangers is there are lots of simplifications of what happens in Poland. And there's a resistance narrative after the war that's still very powerfully important in Polish history and to Polish patriotic narratives, which is a straightforward narrative of resistance. The problem with that is that's not quite true either. Poland is incredibly divided politically before the war. An invasion and occupation don't simplify anything. And so in this underground of people willing to resist and fight the Nazis, there are people fighting with each other.
Yeah.
And that's not, and there are people not only fighting with each other, there are people denouncing each other to the Gestapo, which is precisely why this has to be secret, why people have to have code names. There are people denouncing each other to the Gestapo under torture. Kossak is herself interrogated. One of the ironies of this is, for someone like Kossak, who's an anti-Semite, is it's possible that her brother-in-law, the brother of her second husband, who doesn't seem to be a character in her life in a way that I found in the archives, but he probably betrays her, but under torture. And one of the ironies is they don't know how important she is. They don't know what she's publishing because it's all under code names. And they think she might be Jewish because for a woman, there's no objective way to tell. The irony, of course, is she's a devout, passionate Catholic. And it's one of the things that earns her trip to Auschwitz, which she survives. She's actually sprung by a resistance group that manages to bribe people to get her out at the end of the war. So there's lots of little tangents and trajectories here. Sometimes I worry, well, I'm talking about this guy. Well, what about all the people who opposed him? Well, nevertheless. So moving from information and information trafficking, the next level here is one that we might not anticipate, especially if we're thinking about more conventional military history. But I think it's really important. So bear with me here just for a second on this one, is what do you do with information? What do you do if you have an occupier during a war that understands that your people are dangerous because they might think for themselves, they might build their own government? Well, if you're Nazi Germany, you shut down higher education because educated people are dangerous. So this is on the left. These are the main gates of Warsaw University on Krahelska-Filipowicz, the major road that goes through historic downtown Warsaw. And it's the biggest university in Poland, not the oldest, but it's the biggest, has the largest faculty. And so the Nazis shut it down, understandably. And what do they do with the professoriate? Well, they kill them if they can find them. They're some of the people on those initial target lists, 1939, 1940. They forbid classes from being held. They close libraries. They forbid people from studying. Young people could be executed if they're caught studying. I should tell my students this more often, but I won't go there. Sometimes I like to tell them, I'm like, other people, when they lived under duress, valued the things you take for granted, but maybe that's not the right direction to go in. And then the Wehrmacht, the German army and the SS take over university buildings. They loot them. They use some of the main library buildings as stables for Wehrmacht horses. So it's deliberate humiliation. So what happens is the professors, who don't exactly have other jobs, they decide to moonlight as underground educators, and they build a university underground. And for young people, some of them are just continuing along with their normal lives. They went to class in the spring of 1939. In the fall of 1939, they go to class again, except in secret apartments illegally across the city. That's criminal. You can be executed for it. You can go to Pawiak for it. A lot of the students, therefore, that's a stepping stone into much more aggressive resistance, into violent resistance, because they're already on the wrong side of the occupation if they do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I've loved everything so far, but that's once you're feeling you've taken the first step, the second step is a lot easier. It's the first step. And so just going for education, you're now suddenly part of a cult, in a sense. You're part of something outside of officialdom. So therefore you've made one leap. And that's really, I'm learning a lot, which is the point, I think. Good.
The Polish phrase, there are lots of phrases for this, and they're always ambiguous, right? They understand this is our war. Is the phrase is sometimes we're in the movement, w ruchu, or sometimes in the army, even before there's a proper home army, w armii. And what do they mean by this? You think, oh, they're carrying a rifle. No, sometimes it means they're studying biology. Okay. Why? Because they can be killed for that. They understand it as a patriotic activity. I will note, and one of the things my research revealed is that university students, the university is feminized. Why? Because in 1943 and 1944, a lot of these students who were politicized by study directly joined the fighting units of the home army. So by the end of the occupation, most of the people who are still primarily studying as their means of resistance, of opposition, are women, even in disciplines that are traditionally male, like engineering and the hard sciences. So the guy here, and this is the front cover of his book. You see the name. I hope this is clear now. I'm super nearsighted, so I hope that any viewers can see them. His name is Tadeusz Manteuffel. He's a historian, and maybe this is a little self-involved, but this is a world, and this is an occupation in which historians are actually political actors, because, of course, teaching and researching Polish history or broadcasting are illegal. So Manteuffel participates in this, and he teaches what are called underground or flying classes, because they move from place to place. And then he survives the war, and he tries to collect from his colleagues who he knows taught underground classes to write a history of what happened. And because he did, and he dumped it in the university archives, I have lots of these. But it's not just university students, men and women in their 20s who are studying. If you could go to the next slide, it's much younger kids. And this might be the decision of their parents, who understand it as patriotic, or maybe they just understand it as practical. Or, and this is another part of the occupation, Poles understand that one of the things that's happening to them while they're being occupied is that they're being, I don't know, demoralized, that their lives are being forced into the gutter. So many Polish parents, if they can possibly afford it, want their kids study in Warsaw. So junior high schools and high schools turn to the underground. Why? Because what we would call, I don't know what the British system is exactly, like a college preparatory high school, one that grants a formal degree at the end. And in Poland, the final exam when you finish high school to get yourself into university is called a matura, which is a maturing exam. Those are shut down, because the Nazi administration doesn't just shut down the university, it shuts down higher high schools, it shuts down seminaries, it shuts down anything that's going to train anyone to do anything serious. Obviously, military academies, okay? Also seminaries. So all of these college preparatory high schools that the intelligentsia send their kids to are shut down. And some of them pretend to be agricultural or vocational high schools. We used to call VOTech. But they're actually teaching the kids Latin and Greek. So some of those exist, and that's a complex double game that can get you killed very quickly. But others take an entirely underground resistance. And this image here is from the records of one of only 2 high schools. This one is the Prus High School in downtown Warsaw, where the records survived. And I went through hundreds of these that I know that people studied, because I found their diaries, and I know they were killed in Pawiak, and the studying was the thing that got them into resistance. And for only 2 of them, both boys' schools, are there any wartime records extant. And you probably can't see these, but I spent forever on these, and because I'm nearsighted, with them right against my face, and the archivist looking at me like, what are you doing? Please don't lick this material. And as far as I know, no one had really opened them up, because apparently only I care. So what you can see in the front on the left, I hope somebody else cares just to make my life worthwhile. Is that if it's sort of reddish, but it's faded, it's an old student copybook. So I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this. Is we had, when I was a kid, composition books, those black marbled ones, but sometimes schools, especially private schools, would print them. And so what you can see, if you look at this, it's the name of the school. It's the pre-war copybook, like a student's exam book where they do grammar exercises. In all of the records of what they did underground during the occupation, totally illegal, for which all of the teachers and all of the students could be killed, are in 4 of these copybooks pasted on here, okay? And what is this? So on the right here, they've outlined the schedule of these kids, of what they're taking at what time of the day. They have Latin, they have Polish, they have math, and it's all worked out here. And you can see there's pages and pages of these. And at the top left here, which I've covered up a little bit, it's the names, and it's a boys' school, so it's gender segregated. Before the war, it was a junior high, but what they did is they turned it into a high school as well. So keep boys within the community and to keep them from immediately joining the army. So they kept them in this fold. And the names are crossed out either when a boy dies or when he stops studying. And in most of these, there's his address in Warsaw. So the name, the apartment and things. And pages and pages of these, the address is being crossed out, right? The family leaves, they're persecuted, they join the army, father is killed, right? Runs out of money. But more apartments are crossed out, the names, because they're meeting in an apartment, they're meeting in a location, and somebody finds out about it, it's denounced, and they keep finding more and more and more. And by the end, there's very few that they're using. What happens to these boys? Because they're boys, disproportionately, they fight in the Warsaw Uprising. And there's a series of sort of heartbreaking documents sitting in the archives. One of the leaders of one of these boys' schools after the war tries to survey the boys and try to figure out what the underground education meant. And he sends out the surveys. And one of the last question on the survey after, what's your name? And, what does your dad do? And, what did you take during the war? And what grades did you get? It's what happened to you during the uprising? And there's the questionnaire, but there's not the return because most of the boys died. In fact, one of the Latin teachers lives. Yeah, right. Because think about how old they are. If in 1939, 1940, they're studying the underground, they're at a college preparatory high school. By 1944, they're old enough to fight, right? And they've already been doing these illegal things. Okay? So, and you can trace a lot of these. And I'll note that there's only 2 high schools for which I found these. One of them is in Żoliborz, which is a really important place for the 1944 uprising. And this one, the Prus High School, is downtown. I know lots of the rest of them exist, and girls' schools as well. But these are the only ones for which we have records. But you can go through these, and they graded hard. They had tough exams. They mention other things they're doing. And all of this is arranged illegally.
I mean, people are just saying how groundbreaking this is and how amazing this is. And I'm thinking now, if I had chosen for the graphic to advertise this show, a picture of a couple of Polish kids learning Latin in an underground classroom, and it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have. I mean, I had to put a picture of someone with a rifle because that, again, it's our perception of what resistance is. But this is filling in so many gaps in the journey to the Warsaw Uprising, which I expect most people watching this are aware of that. As you say, it's treated as a separate subject, but it's fascinating stuff. I'm absolutely loving it today.
Oh, well, a lot of these things, I was looking for more direct violence when I started the research, and then I kept finding other things, and that what are people doing? What do they think is important? And I had to eventually start paying attention to the things I found as I was thinking people are arranging sabotage, they're stockpiling weapons. And then I'd find with someone who I knew ended up in prison for stockpiling weapons, that what does he sneak memos out to his comrades about? It's about his Latin seminar, right? Is that people are doing different things than you might think. They want to fight, but considering the nature of the persecution against them, lots of things for them are a fight that wouldn't be to us.
Yeah, and it's because it's what you're talking about in some ways is long-term resistance rather than short-term resistance. Right. Short-term resistance is if you blow up that train that stops the enemy getting supplies this week, is having an immediate effect on the enemy. But educating people, we mustn't forget the Nazis had the idea for 1,000-year Reich. If they were able to quash education and everything in all the countries they've occupied, they're increasing their chances of keeping the population subservient and below them. But if there's an underground education going on, that's long-term resistance. I think everybody watching this is realizing that the word resistance is too broad. It means many things, and we're just talking about effectively one city in one country in one war, and resistance is really, really complex. But I'll hand it back to you because this is just fantastic stuff.
It's useful to have that big term, but then we have to break it down. And Holocaust studies, Holocaust history gives us a bunch of breakdowns for the people of the least agency, right? Jews who are being persecuted. So they have this really fine-grained sense of cultural resistance and survival in Jewish communities understood as a term of resistance. But then we need to expand this all the way out to like what the Soviet partisans are doing, right? That's a lot of space there. And so we need further breakdowns. But you're absolutely right. Like the point of this is a long game. Yeah. And I think my youngest participant in underground education, clandestine education, his older brother eventually joined the Home Army. His brother's 4 years older, I think. His name is Maciej Piekarski. And he writes as a much older man the story of this. And he was 7 at the time this was happening. And he's getting illegal schooling. And he apparently kept heckling his dad about why they're doing this, why he has to do all these things, which is time consuming and difficult for the child. The child has to keep things secret, and there are things he's not supposed to say, and there are answers he's not supposed to give, and things. And his father tells his boys, right, is that someday there will be a new Poland, and you need to be educated, right? And he doesn't tell the older boy he can't fight, but the education is first, because if this is not to be a people fully subordinated to the Nazi German will, then the educated people who are murdered have to be replaced. People have to sort of learn a project into being, and that's not incompatible with fighting. It's something else you do.
And as Peter just said, and Peter was born, he said earlier he was born in Warsaw. The risk is exactly the same, whether you're blowing up a train or learning or passing on a newspaper. The risk of deportation and death is exactly the same. So if it's treated the same, then by the aggressor, then the nature of what you're doing is the same as well, isn't it? This is I'm having a good time, because it's a distressing subject in many ways. But this is amazing. I'm on a massive learning curve now.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, and I think about this, I talk about this with people who don't study this war. And so in some ways, this is a genocide, it's a persecution campaign, it's an occupation, but it's also really uplifting to study, because I'm constantly encountering the idea that there are people whose lives are to me almost unimaginably horrible. They don't have any of the things I take for granted. And they get up and they light a kerosene lantern, they memorize Greek verbs, because this is the future.
Yeah.
And as well, that's kind of an astonishing thing. And your commentator is right, but I will note that compound offenses get people into more trouble. If you have underground publications, if you have a school book you're not supposed to have, and you have weapons, you're much more likely to get an execution than if you have one of those things. So the compounding does matter.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Gender matters. Women are punished less harshly than men, and Polish conspirators use this.
Right.
They use women. Women usually are the people who traffic information, precisely because if men are caught with things, they're executed. So there's a difference. And both of these are boys' schools, which, okay, that's fine. The high school, they end up heavily taking part in the Warsaw uprising, but there are definitely also girls' schools, and there are women who study in those girls' schools who are executed for that when they're caught. Next slide. Okay, so this is, somebody mentioned this earlier, is what I'm trying to give you is a sense of escalation. You can cut me off at some point. I'm just going to escalate two steps, I think, until we get to the large scale insurgency of the Warsaw uprising, which is where I'm basically going to end this story, because you've covered this really well on your channel. And
although I think I want you to come back and cover it from your point of view in the future, but yes, sure.
I'm always happy to talk about it. I mean, I love Alexander.
You're definitely coming. If you want to come back, you're definitely coming back. I'm booking you right now. This has been a fantastic end to an enlightening week of shows, but I'll hand it back to you.
Oh, okay, great. I mean, I love, and the weird thing is, of course, is my life is this disconnect between how much Poland, how much of the war, because one of the things I do is for my job, is my bread and butter, is I teach to undergraduates an arcing history of the Second World War. And I only do Hitler's war. I don't know Asia Pacific. And yet I'm always torn between, do I talk about this little episode of this sort of heroic, escapade, this sort of magical moment that you capture, or do I talk about the bigger context so they have a framework? And there's no good answer. And sometimes I end up with semesters where I talk very little about Poland, and it breaks my heart. And some I talk way too much about something or some other thing. So I'm constantly trying that balance, and I never quite get it right. So how do we escalate from information to knowledge to crossing the boundaries of what the Nazi occupation allows? Well, constantly. And time matters here, right? For the Nazi occupation, the creation of what the Nazi Germany calls the general government from Krakow. I'll note that Warsaw is not the capital of Nazi occupation. It's Krakow, or Krakow in the south, precisely to decenter Warsaw and to disconnect from that tradition of Polish statehood. And nevertheless, there's a much firmer police and military presence in Warsaw than in any other place in Poland, because of its enormous size and its importance to the maintenance of the Eastern Front after 1941. So how are we escalating? I hope that's becoming obvious, but as the years go by in the occupation becomes more deadly in certain ways, and young people age into more aggressive resistance. Okay? The first resistors, the men I showed you on that first slide, they looked a little young because I was finding flattering pictures. They're grown men. They were men born before World War I, before Poland was independent. So they're not just resisting, they're going back to resisting. Right? They're following a template that has a certain familiarity for them, even if it's a generation old. But for young people who are born into an independent Poland, the war takes that away. And as they become older, and in war, people age a lot faster. I don't mean just physically, that's obviously true, especially for combatants. But at 14, a young boy in Warsaw could be quite an independent actor, right? Where's his mother to supervise him? She's probably working in a factory the Germans are running. She has to punch in when she's supposed to. She's queuing for food where it's available. She's dodging around a city in which the transportation networks are in a shambles. His father is likely, maybe he's a forced laborer somewhere. Maybe he's escaped and he's in a resistance formation. A 14-year-old is managing his own life. He's doing significant things for his family. And one of the things he's doing is often significant things for the resistance. So young people age into this resistance as the war unfolds and as Poland's place in it shifts, right? With the opening of the Eastern Front in summer 1941. And then as that front develops, Poles are watching it keenly, because to them, Germany and the Soviet Union, the two co-invaders of Poland in 1939, are fighting an existential fight to the death. And which of those states wins matters for Poland, right? In a way that's so concrete and certain, because World War I ends with all of the states that had been occupying Poland, somehow all of them losing, right? It would abandon World War I from, and that's so unlikely. That is the precondition for Polish independence. But in World War II, most Poles, from the romantic to the pragmatic, one of those states that co-invaded Poland in 1939 is going to win. And that option A is bad, and option B is bad. Right? If you're a Polish communist, and there are definitely Polish communists, option B, the Soviets win, is definitely better. If you're a Polish Jew, without question, regardless of your politics, the Soviet victory is better, because Nazi Germany is trying to wipe you off the face of the earth. But watching that war matters, and it sharpens resistance in Warsaw, because what's possible, what's dangerous, what's worth doing is connected to the wider war. Right? Poles understand themselves to be performing on a stage in the Grand Alliance. They think the Western allies, they think all the members of the Grand Alliance are paying attention to them. They're probably wrong, but nevertheless, that informs what they do. So these young people increasingly dominate the story. They study, they traffic in information, they lose their parents, they lose the future they would have had in an independent, in a free Poland. And a lot of them become the actors of the later resistance in 1943, 1944. And this guy at the bottom is a significant figure in Polish history. Some of the viewers may well know who he is. His name is John Bytnar, and he uses the nom de guerre Rudy. And you can see at the top above it is that this is one of the many placards all over Warsaw. I don't know if you've ever been to Warsaw.
I haven't, no.
Warsaw, I have a German friend who was there visiting with me the first time when I was staying there to do research, and she's like, it's like living in a mausoleum. It's placarded with violence, right? Especially from 1944. This one is earlier. It's Jan Bytnar. So I said it at the outset that resistors can't use violence because they're reprisal. Well, as the occupation continues, the thought is the violence might be worth it. There might be no other options. The willingness to use violence, the degree of violence increases. And younger people are less restricted by this idea of reprisal because they're thinking in a different timeline. So Bytnar is one of these people. He starts out as a scout in underground scouting. He gets involved in diversion. He gets involved with a group that's later brought into the Home Army. He's trafficking in weapons. His dad's probably also involved. And he's arrested. He's held in Pawiak. He's tortured extensively. And his buddies in these underground organizations, the scouting ones, which have become key in sabotage, which is much more aggressive than what was happening a year or two before, decide they've got to spring him. And they're going to try to spring him from Pawiak prison, which is basically impossible. It's guarded, it's behind barbed wire, it's behind a colonnade inside the ghetto. So what do? They wait when he's being trucked between Gestapo headquarters outside the ghetto and the prison. How do they find out all this information? They have an operation, right? This is where the resistance becomes operational. It's called Mexico 2 is the code name of the operation. They have people in the prison who are in the prison because they were part of their conspiracy. They're trafficking information in and out. They get information when Bitnar is being trucked across the city, and they pick an intersection, famous intersection, downtown Warsaw, top right corner, outside of the old historic arsenal. So this comes to be called Operation Arsenal. And they attack the Gestapo transport with weapons. They kill a number of the people guarding it, and they spring Bitnar. And he's wounded so badly, he's tortured so badly, he dies shortly thereafter. But it becomes the sensation of Warsaw, is that the underground has actually attacked the police directly. They've contested the occupation's ability to police them. So this is a symbolic heightening of what happens here. And this is March of 1943. This is just before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. One of the thoughts, how does the Holocaust connect here? Poles expected that there'd be a huge wave of reprisals, that there'd be mass executions for this as punishment. What happens instead? The uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. Effectively, Polish Jews and Polish Jewish resistors take the heat off of the fallout of Bitnar. And the Gestapo turns its attention to massacring the insurgents in the Warsaw Ghetto. But after this, on the streets of Warsaw, prisoners, the Gestapo themselves, personnel of the Wehrmacht, it's increasingly open season on them. So these resistance groups get more and more aggressive. I was going to do one more level of escalation. Do we have time for that, or should I?
Yeah, we can. Yep.
Okay.
So next slide.
Yes. This is what I think is in some ways the most effective thing that the Warsaw Underground, the resistance, does. Bracketing, of course, the uprising in 1944, and bracketing it properly because that's not effective in its goals. Right? The goals of launching an uprising in the summer of 1944 are actually to liberate Warsaw, and that doesn't work. The Poles get something else entirely. But in 1943, what the mature underground, and it's the AK leading things, but the key personnel they're using are young scouts who'd been information couriers, who'd been educated underground, young men and young women involved in this, Varsovians, the children of the intelligentsia, now teenagers and adults, young adults. And they are called the anti-Gestapo units, okay? And what do? They launch in 1943, intensifies late 1943 and into the beginning of 1944, an operation they call Akcja Główki, or Operation Heads. They're killing the people in charge of the occupation. And Heads riffs off of, the people who are running Warsaw, but also the death's head insignia on the SS, the Totenkopf. So they're going to kill them, and they have a list. And that list is the counter to the ones that the Gestapo, that the SS brought in 1939. This is the revenge. Who's getting it? The young surviving intelligentsia. They've got a long list of names. Do they get all of them? No. But they get a couple. This guy on the right, Ludwig Fischer, totally boring, complete careerist, social climbing, a Nazi. He's the civilian governor of Warsaw. He's on the list. They're not going to get him. He's behind guard at the Palais Brule, which is bottom left, just entrenched, surrounded with guards. They try to kill him. It doesn't work. He ends up on trial in Warsaw after the war. He will be killed by Varsovians eventually. But they do kill several other people. One of them is the main, unsurprising, he's the guy running Pawiak prison, Franz Burkel. Because, of course, they're going to take out this symbol of their persecution, this prison political power, Pawiak. Problem with that, of course, is he's got an armed guard. He has an armored limousine. He lives in the residential district. So they hunt him. They track him. They use information. And finally, after several botched attempts in Akcja Burkel, the Burkel operation, in September 1943, 7th of September, they kill Burkel. And there's punishment for it. Poles are forbidden from driving cars. They're cleared from the streets. There's a police hour. The curfew hour is imposed. And what happens? They take revenge on the prisoners of Pawiak. They kill huge numbers of them in revenge for this. So in late 1943, Poles are increasingly aggressive, and they're increasingly willing to pay the costs of that aggression. So violence is racketing off both sides. The most successful thing Operation Heads does, and this is ugly guy in the center, this is Franz Kuchera. Who's not a figure that's known, I think, much outside of Poland. He's the head of the SS. He has as his grisly designation, he's responsible for more executions of Poles than any SS commandant in the entire occupation, with the exception of those responsible for the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. So he outkills the rest of the SS in Poland. And that's a hard tally to hit. He's also Himmler's brother-in-law. He married. So what does he represent to the Polish underground? An attack on Himmler. They spend a lot of time trying to get themselves Kuchera. And they finally find him and they kill him on the 1st of February, 1944. So by the early 1944, this resistance, which increasingly is willing to use violence, because what are their options, right? Is willing to attack the occupation and its administration openly. And it's in that environment, that's the deep backstory here, in which as the Eastern Front moves back towards Warsaw, this larger organization says, this is our moment, this is our only moment. And as the Red Army approaches the Vistula in the late summer of 1944, the mature Home Army takes its young people, it takes its resistors, it shuts down education, it shuts down most of the newspapers, except last slide, I think there is our last hero here.
There we go.
Kamiński. This is his Bulletin Informacyjny when the uprising is launched on the 1st of August, 1944. Now a daily. First thing it says on this first headlines is Warsaw is fighting. Okay, is that he has returned to the struggle that he wanted to help launch with this publication. And this is increasingly a community of people that understood itself as resisting occupation, that understood itself as contesting occupation using a variety of means. And in the late summer of 1944, those means include outright violence. Is this violence successful? No. But it comes from this increasing and escalating willingness of this leadership of the city and the young people aging into these positions to fight off a Nazi German occupation that means that they don't have a national existence in the long term. So for them, the stakes could not be higher. Right?
Wow.
I think, I could go into lots of things, but that's approximately where I wanted to get to. It just took me a little longer.
I think we will basically just have to have a part 2 and bring you back and expand on this, because it's all really good stuff and I've learned a lot. And I think everybody watching is going to agree that we've just basically learned to redefine what resistance is. And resistance doesn't need to be, how do you measure the success of it? Because you said there, a lot of the people, the targets weren't actually killed, but that the intentions are there. And particularly I've appreciated this filling in the gaps of the education aspect and the printing of the underground newspapers. It's been absolutely enlightening. And several people have said that you can come back every week, and they wanted a Jadwiga, a weekly Jadwiga, so Jadwiga, something like that. So you've been a resounding success. So I mean, you have written a book, Survivors, and I like the fact, I'll put the banner up and you've got a copy of it there. Again, it's this emphasis on not the victims. Again, if people did come out of this to see eventually a new Poland, and I think that again gets a bit lost in the tragedy of Auschwitz and the deportations and the death, is that many people did flourish. Not as many victims as well, but there are enough survivors to want to hear their story and understand the significance of that, because out of that, the phoenix of the Poland that we know today has been born. So fantastic stuff. Well, I think we'll just end it there. And yeah, so we'll think about talking to you and bringing you back for a part 2, or we can expand on this and we can talk about the Warsaw Uprising or whatever, if you're happy to come back. I'm always happy to come back. I love talking about this stuff. It doesn't show, he said. No, it does show. No, it's been fantastic. So, well, we'll leave it there, folks. So I'll just, next week, Monday, folks, we start our Raids and Operations Week on Monday. We'll look at Operation Foxley with Eric Lee. And then there's other things coming up later on. But right now, I'm going to just bring back and just say, well, thank you very much for joining us, basically. And it's been fantastic. So, yeah, I on that note, I will say this is Paul Woodadge for WW2TV, and I will see you all again on Monday. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching. Bye.